Wait and see is a terrible strategy. And that is the strategy that many pediatricians give. And so I think if you meet somebody who says, wait and see, no, we're finding the next person. Watch and see, I am sometimes a fan of, because there are some kids who just need a minute to kind of gather themselves.
And it's a ticket talking Mazda for the biggest. That's a comma and a comma and a comma. Gotta get it. And it's a ticket talking Mazda for the biggest. That's a comma.
Hi, Gabriele. Nice to see you again.
Hi, Cerise. Thanks for having me.
I'm so excited to have you as a guest because you have a unique expertise. And can you tell me a little bit about your background?
Yeah. So I finished my undergrad and didn't really know what I wanted to do. And so I got a job in an office. And within 3 years, I was like, oh no, this cannot be.
I can relate.
Yeah. And it became very clear that I had a lot of helping traits, and I did some, Myers-Briggs and that kind of stuff. So all of these helping professions came up. I went and shadowed a couple of people. And the first time I watched a pediatric speech language pathologist or a pediatric speech therapist work with the child they were working with, I was like, oh, that's me. And so I applied to grad school. I ended up having to do a 3-year master's because speech language pathology is one of these things where you have to have an undergraduate major. So I did my undergrad requirements, I did my graduate requirements, and that was in 2001. And I haven't looked back. And I've always worked in very young pediatric populations. So like if I can get them 2 and under, I'm very happy. If I can get them 5 and under, I'm pretty happy. And I started my private practice in 2009. I should mention I had 2 children between 2002 and 2006. And sort of grew the practice working part-time with 2 small kids. And, my caseload got full. And so I hired a contractor, and then she got full. And so I hired another contractor, and it kind of grew from there. And if we flash forward, these 15 years, I now have 10, I always forget because the people sort of come and go. There's a core that stays, and then there's a few that come and go. About 10 therapists who work for me all over the DC area, doing a mix of in-person and now virtual due to the pandemic. We still have some virtual clients for whom that really works well. And so, that's kind of how I got here.
Wow. So you're the perfect guest, not only because of your professional expertise and the age range of my audience, but also like journey of you starting, not being so sure what you wanted to do, but then, not just settling with like, okay, this is what I study, I'm going to stick to it. You went with your passion and you made it successful, like you were able to scale your business. So I want to hear all about that in the time frame that we have. We'll see what we managed to squeeze in.
Yeah. No, it was really interesting because it was so clear to me. And it was so interesting because, again, I had this office job where I was paid what I thought at the time was an inordinately large sum of money to basically push paper around my desk and, be nice to people. It was like a customer service position. I was using my language skills. I had an undergrad in French language, so fine. And it was an international organization, but just the fact of being inside, sitting at a desk all day was really it was becoming obvious that was really not how I needed to be. And I think even something as simple as like understanding that you need to move.
Yes.
Right. Or understanding that you want to be outside from time to time. Like for me, it was a little bit of that. Like, okay, well, I know I don't want to be inside at a desk. What does that mean? Where do I want to be? And then, certainly there was a career counselor that I ended up seeing at the organization where I was. And her job was mostly to place people internally.
And you ended up.
Yeah.
Oops.
She took one look at my profile and she was like, no, you have to get out of here.
Well, that's nice of her.
Yeah. She was fantastic.
Yeah.
But it is a little bit of, particularly early on, just having enough experiences where you know what you don't want sometimes.
Right.
Not everybody has like Not everybody springs from the womb and is like, and I shall be a nurse, or I shall run a nonprofit, or whatever. Like, not everybody has that.
Right. Yeah. Mine was similar. I never even heard of, I didn't even know what a dietitian was or a nutritionist. At first, I thought I wanted to be a doctor. And then soon I realized, I'm like, okay, I don't want to be in school this much longer. I'm like, that's out the question. And then also just during my internship and everything, I was like, yeah, that was the right decision. And then once I decided I wanted to be a dietitian, I knew also during my internship, I said, oh, I do not want to sit in a clinic or be at a hospital hours on and just seeing people back to back to back. And I was so fortunate to, like, from the beginning recognizing that, and then finding just like cool places that I had never even known I could, like, you know, different studies, or like when we spoke about when I first met you, to be like a lunch inspector. I would go to different schools and like observe their lunch and like the kids eating. And so I was fortunate that I also listened to my voice, like, Cerise, you know, you're not going to do this. Now you need to find a way.
Yeah.
Yes. Wow. So now let's get back to your topic and your expertise. I was doing some research about you, and there's some terms that I wasn't familiar with before, like Orchid Kids. Could you explain to us what that means?
Yeah, there's a book called The Orchid and the Dandelion by Thomas Boyce, Boyce. I would recommend that you watch his TED Talk rather than read the book. The book is long. And
Busy
he
mom
does a
noted.
good job. Yeah, he does a good job in the TED Talk. Basically, the principle is there are in the group of children, and he did his research on adverse childhood experiences. So in the group of children that exist in the world, about 20% of them are going to be highly sensitive to their environment. And so in his work, looking through the lens of ACEs, these adverse childhood experiences, when those children, those sensitive children, experienced ACEs, they had outsized detrimental effects from them. But here's the interesting part of the research, which is when those children got appropriate intervention, when they got what they needed emotionally, they were able to become very resilient and very hardy and really thrive. So it's a both and situation. There are a subset of kids who are very sensitive to their environments, and when they get what they need, they are the most remarkable humans. And so that's kind of what we mean when I say an orchid kid. It's a highly sensitive, and there's different terms, you know, out there for them. Here's what I mean when I say it. It's, you know, quirky, ADHD, autistic, neurodivergent, complicated, challenging, spirited. I mean, these are all terms that have come up throughout the years in the literature.
Right.
There's a book from the, I don't know, 80s or 90s called, you know, Raising Your Spirited Child, right? And really what it is somebody who is not gonna just go along to get along. These are not people-pleasing children. And often that is really irksome to the adults, number one. And number two, there's a lot of friction between the child and the environment until or unless we modify the environment on behalf of the child. And so, so that's kind of what we took from this original book.
And I like the emphasis on the and, like they're sensitive children, maybe they're complicated children, and with the right guidance and tools and strategies, they can be resilient and live a great life.
Listen, it's really, and I love the orchid metaphor speaks to a lot of parents, obviously, who come through our classes, and we have a course that we run several times a year, my colleague and I, because it's so non-pathologizing. Like, we don't blame an orchid for needing indirect light, a constant temperature, 2 ice cubes a week, you know, or however you do water, right? We don't say, oh my God, I'm giving you all this water in direct sun. Why won't you bloom?
Right.
Well, that's because that's what, you know, for example, roses need, not orchids, right? So it's just
That's beautiful.
a different variety of flower, right?
Right. And you use the name of your podcast is Complicated Kids. So are those synonymous? Orchid Kids, Complicated Kids?
Yeah, I think, you know, all of these are kind of intersecting Venn diagrams where for me anyway.
Right.
I think of them as complicated because many times their parents are finding them very challenging to parent.
Right.
Again, they're the kids who they don't just go and put their shoes on when you ask them to. They get lost in the classroom, in their preschool classroom, from the table to the trash can to throw their trash away. They wander around the circle at circle time instead of sitting down on their little carpet square. They have a hard time falling asleep. They resist, fill in the blank. They resist a lot of things. And there are some good reasons for that. And we go into that in the class, and I talk a lot about why that's happening. And really that's a nervous system calibration thing. And we can talk about that a little bit more if you want, but yeah, these are the kids. They're challenging. They're complicated. Like something is not going the way we expected it to go.
Expectations. Yeah.
Expectations.
And as you describe this, I'm sure everyone knows like, oh, okay, I know what she's talking about. You're describing like classmates and siblings and family members and so, and I feel like now that I'm a mom, I'm much more aware and sensitive to this. When I see a mom who's maybe at the store and she might have a complicated child that's like having a tantrum, and where do you say it's nature or nurture? Because I know that mom, she's probably doing the best that she can, and she probably feels so much guilt. Why is my child behaving like this? But then you also have the other people judging her. So what do you say to that?
First of all, solidarity and respect and peace. So I'll tell you a story. I once went to the grocery store, which is a terrible idea, with my 2-year-old. I mean, going to the grocery store is a terrible idea. Bringing a 2-year-old to the store is also a terrible idea. But sometimes we have to do it, right?
Yeah.
And so I did as much prep as I could in advance. And that's a strategy I highly recommend. If you're going to be going somewhere with a toddler in particular, but also with any age child, particularly a complicated one, you want to preview as much as you can. Yeah. This is like, write this down.
Right.
You want to preview as much as you can in a way that the child will understand what will be happening. So we are going to go to the store. We're going to only buy the things that it says on my list. You can help me put things in the cart, right? And you try to keep it as positive as possible. What we don't want to say is you're not getting candy, right? Because the only thing they hear when you say that is candy. Right. And now they're like, candy, 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 candy. So we keep it positive. We create ways that they can be helpers. Kids love to help, even if when it's not actually helping. Sometimes it takes more work, right? So I did all this preview on. Okay, great. You can also, like, especially if you're going to go somewhere that is not interesting to your child, like, think about what time of day you're going to do that, right? Or maybe we're not going to do that right before nap time if we can avoid it. Okay. So I went, and kiddo started having a meltdown. I think it was probably too close to nap. She was probably hungry. I don't know. Something caught her eye. Who knows? And I had this very visceral, I had a cart full of groceries. And then my child was melting down. And I was like, oh, you need, and I can't remember what the thing was. Let's say you need a nap. And I left the full cart of groceries, and I hauled my daughter, like basically like in a football hold, under my arm to the car, shoved her in the car gently, took her home, put her to bed. But the override that I had to do in that moment was to not care that people were judging me, and to really dial in to my child about what she needed in that moment. And that was something that I was and am really able to do. And I think that that's not the case for lots of people. So I think, even just realizing, oh, my child is melting down, I can stay calm. I don't need to fix this. Like, I don't need to make them feel better. I can choose how I want to respond, Like I could have stayed in line at the grocery store and just let her scream. That would have been stressful for me, stressful for her, and stressful for everybody else. And the everybody else, honestly, when you can get there, they don't matter. They really don't matter. And I know that seems like pie in the sky, but the more you can loosen other people's opinions about your parenting, the better off you and your child are going to be.
Right.
Because we have so many voices in our heads. You know, we have our parents, we have our in-laws, we have our sister, our older sister who like is doing it perfectly, you know.
Yeah.
We have our neighbor. Everybody's got an opinion about what should be happening. Nobody's actually the parent of your child except you.
Yeah, that's something that I have, my son just turned to literally like a few days ago. But this is something that I experienced as a new mom, everybody's input. And I'm also like, that's something that my sister did tell me early on, because my son, he was like, he didn't want to sit in the stroller and he started crying. And I did have that like, oh no, like, you know, he's interrupting everyone's peace and he's screaming. We were at the mall and she told me, don't worry about everybody else. Like she said, they had kids and they were probably worse than, like she just made me feel better. And I was like, okay. And I try to keep that mindset. If like anything, I'm like, whatever, he's a kid. And I'm all for like leaving the shopping cart, and I'm all for that approach. Like if he needs to take a nap, let's just make it better for everyone.
Yeah, listen, you know, and the other thing is nobody else is responding to the frequency of your child fussing the way that you are. So just like in the moment, if you can remember, like I can remember like these epic meltdowns where it'd be like, oh my God, it's like a nail into my head, right? That frequency, that like, and that's why we say pushing our buttons, right?
Right.
Only our kids have our buttons, and other people don't have that button. So
Yeah, that's a
they're
nice
not
analogy.
they're not having the same responses we are. We think they are. They must be because it's so horrible. And it's just not.
Yes, that's a good one to remember, right? They're pressing our buttons. Those other people don't have. They're not connected to our child like we are.
Yeah. Yeah. It's funny. Stuart Shankar wrote a book called Self-Reg that talks about what you just said, which is when our children are in utero, we're connected to them via the umbilical cord. When they are born, now they're walking around outside of our bodies, but guess what? We're still connected. And our nervous systems are connected via Wi-Fi. And he calls this the interbrain. In other words, the connection between my nervous system and my child's nervous system. And again, that is like a unique frequency and connection, energetic connection between the two of us that doesn't exist. You know, and again, if you have two parents, then you have that also with your other parent, and caregivers. But strangers do not have that with my child, right? And so this notion that if you can remember that, it becomes much easier to be aware and in your thinking brain rather than your reptilian brain, you know, being in your upstairs brain versus your downstairs brain in terms of like, oh my God, because when the baby is crying, and the baby could be 7 years old, your parent brain is going to go, oh my God, the kid's going to die. I got to fix this problem.
Yes, you feel like you're like tormented. Like if I hear him crying and my husband's like, "Oh, he's okay. I'm handling it," and I just can't. I like come to the room because it's like we feel their pain or their anguish.
Yeah, we really do. But becoming aware of that is the process of raising an increasingly older child who, by the way, our job as parents is to raise functional adults. So like,
Yes,
we would do well to start with the end in mind, right?
Right. So tell me, when or how early can we, I don't know, diagnose that we have an orchid kid or a complicated child? You said you start around 2, but can we see signs of that earlier on?
Oh,
like
for
my
sure.
son had a tantrum in the shopping the shopping mall. Is he a complicated child?
No. Okay, first of all, right. So we have to know something about developmental milestones, right? All toddlers experience communication frustration. all toddlers become dysregulated. All people become dysregulated from time to time. What do I mean by dysregulated? They have a meltdown. They cry. They're processing big feelings. They're feeling whatever they're feeling. They're really mad and they're tearing the books down the shelf, right? All of that is very expected. The things that are less expected are going to be like qualitative things. Like, for example, my child is having frequent meltdowns that last more than 30 minutes at a time, right? My child is engaging in behaviors that are hurting them or other people consistently, right? So it's a qualitative thing, not so much, my toddler had a meltdown at the store. Are they an orchid? No, probably not. And I also think parents have a really good sense of it. These orchids tend to be very fussy babies. So they have, colic or reflux. They've got digestive issues sometimes. They don't sleep well sometimes. They're hard to get down for a nap or for the night. They either need to be touched all the time after the newborn stage, or none of the time, right? They are, sorry, that was my phone. They are particular about which cup they have. Now, again, like most 2-year-olds have had a tantrum or a meltdown, as we call them, because tantrum implies some measure of control. Meltdown is really explaining what's happening, which is like, it is a mind storm.
They reach the max and they're just
Exactly. Most 2-year-olds, some 3-year-olds have had a meltdown because you gave them the blue cup instead of the green cup. Okay. They were picturing the blue one. They got the green one. They were like, oh, this is not what I wanted. Okay. So that's very expected sometimes. If it's every time and I only drink from that cup, now we're in a qualitative difference, right?
Right.
So it's never black and white. And so, the thing I would say is it's never too early to ask for another eye. Often the pediatricians are the first glimpse of that. Often, at least in the US, the pediatricians have so much else to do that they're not super sensitive to parental concerns. And so I would say, listen, if something is keeping you up at night and you're like, oh gosh, is my kid okay? Even if that child is 6 months old, because there's lots happening from a communication standpoint and a brain development standpoint, from birth through age 5. I mean, 95% of our brains are developing in the way that they will be developed, through, I can't remember what the statistic is exactly, but like certainly in early childhood. Right. So if you have questions, reach out to a parent coach, reach out to a speech therapist, reach out to an occupational therapist, reach out to a child psychologist. Like, a phone call and email is going to get you peace of mind.
Right.
And instead of just kind of thinking it's going to work itself out, and you have that nagging feeling. Parents know, they know. And I think we're just used to like overriding that feeling too much.
Or being in denial, or maybe not wanting that stigma, because we had a family friend who, like, it's like everyone knew that her child was on the spectrum, and she was so sensitive about it in the beginning, and then when she like finally got confronted by like the daycare to get her diagnosed and everything, and she has autism. And now she's such a like autism mom. Like, we're like, see, you were like making this big deal about it, and it's not even a big deal. Like, and now she's much older and she developed fine. She's speaking. Like, so sometimes I think parents are afraid, like, oh no, what does this mean? And
listen, that is a very like survivalist. That's our survival brain in action, right? Protect us from pain, keep us in the group, and try to find, the ease where we can. And so for a time, for people, the ease is ignoring the problem because it's not there all the time, just some of the time, you have these little spikes, and we're avoiding pain and we're in the group. It's very challenging, particularly in autism, because I think people have outdated misconceptions about what autism is and what autism isn't. So there's that. And that's like a whole podcast unto itself. But I also think, when you have a diagnosis of any kind, it puts you outside the group of typical, like parents who don't really have to think about how they are parenting their children. And that's why I say on the Complicated Kids podcast, like parenting can feel like an extreme sport if you've got a complicated kid, right? It's not, we're just walking down the street like the way everybody else does. That's not what it's about. And that's scary and that's hard. And one of the reasons Jen and I created our Raising Orchid Kids classes is because many, many of the families who come to us have never met another family whose child is, non-compliant or uncooperative or autistic or has ADHD. Like they don't know anybody who's struggling like that. That's not to say they think they don't know anybody who's struggling like that. Right?
Yeah, because it's so common, but some people kind of keep it inside. Or I feel like now it's starting to be less of a, thing that you hide. But before, people were afraid to say, oh, my child is dyslexic or autistic. And now it's like, I think, at least in that, we see some progress nowadays.
Yeah, I agree. I think it is the level of acceptance of our differences is an important step toward kind of self-understanding, toward creating a more inclusive culture, a more inclusive world. Yeah, it's just better for everybody.
Right. So say a mom or a dad, they have a hint of feeling, an intuitive gut feeling that their child is complicated. So you're saying the first step is to go to like a child psychologist, or what would be the first step? Like those professions that you mentioned?
I would say, yeah, I think, start with your pediatrician. If you don't get the feeling that they've taken you seriously, here's what I would say. If you ask the pediatrician and they say, oh, it'll be fine, then go to level 2, which would be some kind of pediatric child specialist. Be that, again, a speech therapist, an occupational therapist, or a child psychologist, or a social work kind of mental health worker who works in pediatrics. And it might take you a minute to find the right provider. One of the things I do on the SpeechKids side of things, so on my speech therapy practice, is I do developmental consults where I'm looking not just at communication development, but at motor development, at cognitive development, at social emotional development. I have a questionnaire that I give to parents about, sort of when did we achieve milestones and that kind of thing, to create kind of a holistic picture of what's happening, and then make recommendations if I think that, there needs to be some kind of intervention or some kind of watch and see situation. Wait and see is a terrible strategy. And that is the strategy that many pediatricians give. And so I think if you meet somebody who says, wait and see, no, we're finding the next person.
All right.
Watch and see, I am sometimes a fan of, because there are some kids who just need a minute to kind of gather themselves, right? They're just kind of on the backside of the curve, and that's fine. Like not everybody can be, straight A's and tall and, like people are different. That's fine. So we don't want to pathologize things that are not pathologies, but we do not want to miss things that are.
Right.
And we don't want kids to struggle with things that they don't need to struggle with, right? Early childhood in particular is meant to look effortless and robust, right? So when kids are learning to walk, yes, they stumble, they fall, they, sometimes they get hurt, but they pick themselves up and they do it again, and they pick themselves up and they do it again, and they are happy to do so. When I see kids, and I'll tell you a story about an 18-month-old who I saw years ago now, she's 14. She did her bat mitzvah and I went, and it was so amazing. Yeah, it really was. When she was 18 months old, she had just come out of a full body cast for hip dysplasia, and she was not communicating at all. She was not looking at her mother. She was refusing to interact with her mother. And when I got there, I didn't know, was she, did she have cognitive delays? Was she autistic? Was she ever going to speak? I had no idea. And life was really hard for her. And you could see it. She was a fretful, anxious, closed down child. That is the opposite of robust and effortless, right? The good news is we did some intervention. I went there once a week for an hour. I gave mom homework assignments, mini homework assignments, to gradually get her interacting, feeling better in her own body, in her own skin, about the world. We changed some things about the routine, made it more predictable. And within 2 years, this girl was like basically running her preschool classroom.
Wow, amazing.
Yeah, she was the most popular girl in the class, to the extent that a 3-year-old can have popularity, and was thriving, and continues to do so. As I said, I went to her bat mitzvah recently. So it's that, right? If mom had said, oh, it'll get better, I have every notion it would have gotten worse.
Right. And that's amazing. Like with the right early diagnosis, which I feel like in every aspect of life where it's preventing disease, it's always better to tackle things like, ahead of time, that early diagnosis. And then with the right tools, you can prevent a lot of, maybe she would be a lot less self-confident, insecure. So that's amazing.
Yeah.
And you mentioned that you have 2 children. Were one of your kids Orchid children?
Yeah, my daughter. It's funny.
So you have personal experience and professional experience.
Yeah, and you would think that, my professional experience would have inoculated me from the emotional struggle of watching my daughter. So when my daughter was 9 months old, I noticed she wasn't pulling to stand in her crib, and at about 9 months, we expect kids to be holding onto something and then hoisting themselves up. She wasn't doing that. She could sit up, and she kind of scooched around the carpet, using her legs, like in an upright position, was the craziest thing. But she wasn't crawling. She had never crawled, and she wasn't pulling to stand. I went to the pediatrician, and the pediatrician said, I can give it another 3 months. I went back for her 12-month appointment, and I let the pediatrician, kind of weigh in on this, right? And I was like, oh, okay, 12 months. I was like, no, something's going on. She's not pulling to stand, and she's not walking. And in the process, it was a spring day, and it was lovely. And, there's a point at which, when babies are little, you put them on the blanket outside, right? Because you don't want them to have to experience whatever is in the grass or whatever. Well, I was kind of like, she's old enough. I tried to put her on the grass at my house one day, and the girl tried to levitate. I don't know if you've seen, there's a video on the internet, I'm sure it's on Instagram or something, where the parent tries to put the baby on the ground and the legs fly up. That's what she tried to do. And she screamed bloody murder as if I was poking her with a hot stick. And it was clear to me that she was not going to get on the grass that day. Why? And now my early professional brain my childhood professional brain goes to work. Okay. So I took her to a physical therapist, because I was like, well, she's not walking, so clearly this is gross motor. The physical therapist, bless her heart, said, I can teach your daughter to walk, but I think she has a sensory processing disorder.
That's the fear of touching the ground, right?
Correct. The fear of touching the ground. Come to find out, palms of her hands, bottoms of her feet, very sensitive, did not like anything unfamiliar. She would get messy. That's often a sign that kids are avoidant. So that was fine, yogurt on the tray, fine. Familiar though, right? Unfamiliar was a no-go. So that was 12 months. By the time she was 3, she got weekly physical therapy, and then for a few months overlap PT/OT, occupational therapy, sensory-based occupational therapy. By the time she was 3, I sent her to preschool, and I had noted on the application that, she had been through this. And I got a call after 2 weeks of the teachers. They were like, we're not seeing it. And I chose the preschool on purpose because I knew they were very sensitive to children with needs. And they were like, we're not seeing any of this. We'll continue to monitor, but by the way, she's doing fine.
Oh,
And it is the kind of thing, first of all, I cried buckets during those 2 years because I was worried. Was she going to walk? Was she going to have friends? Was she going to be anxious? Was she ever going to, run? Was she going to be able to play a sport? Well, guess what? She's a senior in high school. She's graduating in a month. And she was captain of her track team. She is incredibly gifted as an artist and a musician. She's a confident, happy, secure person who likes herself and others. And I honestly think, but for that early intervention, she would have been an anxious, fretful, fearful person. Now,
wow.
can't prove a negative, but that is, that's her story. And I, I'm a fan
Yeah,
of
me
early
too.
intervention.
And I'm sure like any parent that's listening to this and they have a complicated child, they know that their child can thrive with the right guidance and tools.
Yeah.
Amazing.
And I just think it's a process of finding the people and really trusting your gut. Again, that's why I say if the pediatrician shuts you down, go find somebody who's not going to shut you down, who's really going to listen with an open heart and look and say, yeah, it's okay. Or I see what you mean. Let's try some things. Yeah.
Right. And that's interesting that you said, even though this is your profession. I've heard this before. I interviewed a coach. She deals with autistic children. Oh no, actually, yeah, she does. She deals with autistic children. And then when her son got diagnosed with autism, she said, like, even though she deals with this every day, it was like, whoa, it was a lot for her to process. And you would think it would be easier. And she says, no, because like it just hits closer to home and you just get discombobulated, like as if you're not familiar.
Oh yeah, no, listen, I always tell people I have infinite patience for other people's children, not for my own. And the same goes for that emotional bandwidth. Like I don't have to worry about other people's children in the way that their parents do.
Right.
But I sure did get to worry about my daughter. And here's the thing. Here's the thing about complicated kids in particular. Children in general, but complicated kids in particular. They show us early and often what it is that we need to work on within ourselves. So all children will do this, even the dandelions. These are the easy ones. Even your easy kids at some point in their life will test you. They will bring home a date you don't like. They will take a job you disapprove of. They will paint their house an ugly color, right? Like they're going to do this. And then maybe your call is going to come for complicated kids, for parents who are raising orchid complicated kids. They are experiencing this early and often, and it's an opportunity if we allow it to be. And so, my daughter's experience in therapy and getting early intervention and my needing to go pursue that. I mean, what did it give me? Number one, it gave me perspective. Number two, I got to work through kind of actually my worth as a parent is not tied to her performance. Right.
That's something that I'm sure a lot of people, with everything, not even with complicated kids, with any kid.
Well, and this is why complicated kids are so challenging, right? Because you asked me this at the beginning of the podcast, like what's nurture and what's nature. I actually think a lot is nature. Children come to us as they are. They are not empty vessels that we have to fill with our best and brightest, advice and experience. And I think where we get into trouble is if we think that they are just receptacles for all the things that we want them to have.
Right.
And complicated kids are not, they are unable and unwilling to accept that kind of, I'll call it garbage here for effect, right? They're unwilling and unable to accept that. They have their own stuff. They have their own worth. They have their own ideas. And they are going to force us in many ways to accept that about them.
And you mentioned
right?
this in one of your episodes, and I read some study about this too, how like it's with this misconception that a lot of parents have that we can control like how our children will turn out. And you mentioned like you can't, it's out of your control. Like just give that notion up. You can influence, but it's out of your control.
This notion of, right, influence but not control is really, it's hard to spot when you have a more typically developing child, because your child is going through the motions and your child is walking the path of least resistance or of most commonality. And it's easy to say, oh, it's because I'm such a great parent. And that's just not true. And the reason you know it's not true is because you have another child who is not doing those things and you are the same person.
That's a good point. Right.
It's a trip. It's parenthood is not, it's not for the faint of heart. I think, listen, people have been parents for millennia, obviously. And it's both kind of the best and the worst time to be a parent, right? Because there's never been more information available.
Right. At the click of a button, at the
The
swipe
click
of a finger.
button. Yeah, but it is, I think, for most of those millennia, there were families and communities in place to support,
Right.
particularly neurodivergent folks, and there were fewer of them for sure. But, if you did have a child who was a little bit different, that child was embraced in the community. I was just talking to, I can't remember who it was about this, but where, in Mongolia, this was a woman who had served in the Peace Corps. And she said, there were kids who were clearly different and had limited capacity for connection to the community. And they were plugged in where they were able. If they were able to count, the sheep, then that was what we had them do. And they were accepted and they had a role in the community.
Israel, we have a kibbutzim, like kibbutz, and it's every kibbutz has like that one, like I lived in a kibbutz for the 4 years when I went to college in the north. But I think it's beautiful how they just place them where they can be, where they can contribute to the community. And now we don't have that. Like if you're not in a community that like wants to keep everyone safe and you can kind of just get lost, and they probably don't thrive in the same way.
Yeah. And this, kind of performance driven mentality of like, we have to achieve. It really doesn't work for complicated kids who, by and large, they do want to achieve, but they must be, this is me talking, they must be allowed to achieve on their terms. Right. Forcing them down the path is going to create so much friction and so much resistance, and really in some cases has the capacity to create burnout. Those are the kids who are depressed, who are anxious, who are holed up in their rooms, not going to school. That's a form of burnout. And that's a nervous system reality for them, where they're just kind of fried, because they've been striving for so long, and they just can't anymore.
And you briefly mentioned when we mentioned neurodivergent that it's more like that it wasn't so common back then. So that's another question that's something that I wonder now. I don't know if we're just diagnosing them more, but I do feel like they're more. Sometimes I feel like it's like an overdiagnosis sometimes, but maybe that's just like my ignorance. Like I feel like people are telling like themselves before they even get diagnosed, I'm neurodivergent, I'm autistic,
It is interesting. I think there's several things going on. One is that the criteria have shifted. So for sure there's a bigger net. And there's increasingly, and rightly so, I think, a focus on what is your internal experience of your neurological neurotype, right? And we believe you, right? This notion of like, a person is going to tell you what they experience, and we're going to say, I believe you, instead of, we don't look autistic. Like that is a sentence nobody listening to this podcast should ever say.
Right. Yeah.
Right. And so that's one thing. And it is true that when we talk about neurodivergence, much of the time we're talking about autism, but that's not all of what neurodivergence is, right? Neurodivergence as a term covers
Even ADHD. I had to look it up because
ADHD.
hear so many people that like on TikTok neurodivergent. And I'm like, what is that? And I'm like, maybe I'm neurodivergent. It feels like it's an umbrella for everything.
It is, yeah.
I'm like,
And I think,
hyper.
yeah, yeah. I think so. So it also incorporates like what would be considered mental illness. So like bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, epilepsy, like all of those are forms of neurodivergence. I mean, listen, the conversation is open about, is there such thing as neurotypical?
Right.
Or,
That's when I when I was reading the scope, then it made me think, what is neurotypical?
yeah. And so it's an open question, I think, at this point, and the language is changing quickly.
Right.
And so it'll be interesting to see. But as regards autism in particular, actually, you know what? Anxiety also, by the way, neurodivergence, right? So the big A's, autism, ADHD, anxiety, are definitely increasing. That, I mean, like if we just take anxiety on itself, skyrocketing rates of anxiety, right? Jonathan Haidt just wrote a book.
Especially with the younger generation, if I'm correct.
Yeah.
The Gen Zs, Gen Alpha.
For sure. So why is the open question?
Right.
I happen to think that it's multifactorial, which is why nobody can agree. I think there's for sure a social media component and like a social dynamic that's really unhealthy. I mean, the studies are very clear about screen time, age of onset of getting a phone, and anxiety disorders.
Oh,
like,
yeah, if we can.
There's a direct.
Man, we don't have a lot of time yet, and I have so many questions. I have to bring you on again.
Yeah. So there's that piece of it. I'm sure that there's environmental toxins and pollutants that are affecting our nervous systems.
Right.
I mean, there's just, I don't know that the studies have confirmed, yes, this is the thing, but I think generally the world is a polluted place. We're being born with microplastics in our system. Infants have them.
Right.
For sure, that's got to have a role. And then, we've got a high-powered, disconnected society overall. So then, like, okay, are things, do we not have as many protectants as we once had for sensitive nervous systems? And so are those nervous systems now kind of crossing over into dysfunction in a way that they wouldn't have before? It's an open question. I don't know the answers.
Yeah, and it's like this is a phenomena from like in my field with diabetes, type 1 diabetes especially, where you would see just like maybe 1 or 2 kids come in a month with like type 2 diabetes. And this is not my experience. This is what the older dietitians would tell me like back in the day. Now we see them every day, like a new kid. And they're saying that it's also multifaceted. They're saying like so many things changed. And this is type 1, for whoever doesn't know. It's not, lifestyle related. It's autoimmune. So there's so many things that change in our environment that we can't pinpoint exactly what is causing so many kids to be diagnosed with food allergies and type 1 diabetes. And
and all of those things travel with neurodivergence, right? So what I started to say earlier about colic, eczema. Like if you have a baby with eczema, get on it.
I have, yeah. This is my son has eczema. Yeah.
I mean, eczema is inflammation, right? And there's actually Chris Palmer, who's a psychiatrist at Harvard, wrote a book called Brain Energy. He's basically trying to, may have created a unifying theory of mental illness, of neurodivergence, which is basically like neurological disorders are mitochondrial disorders of the brain. Eczema, is an inflammation, right? So anytime we've got inflammation, we know that there's a problem. And so, lots of kids, we don't pop kids in brain scanners, but we can assume there's some kind of inflammation happening.
Right.
And then, like, what do
Luckily
we do about
now
it?
it's amazing. Question. Like, okay, he's only been on this earth 2 years, but like, it's like the whole winter, I'm just like battling this. And then as soon as the sun comes out, like, that's what I guess, okay, humidity, environment, like I don't know, but it's just, and then it just goes away. And then I'm like, okay, I think it's gone. And the winter came again and it came back. Now it's down. I'm just like, oh, I hope he outgrows this. This is what the doctors are telling us. He might outgrow it. But I'm hearing that a lot of parents are dealing with this, like eczema and asthma and all types of things that weren't so common decades ago.
Yeah. And then there's like the mold question. And like, anyway, you can go down a rabbit hole, and that's the other piece of it is, right? How crazy do you want to make yourself? How worried do you want to be?
Right.
And yet I usually fall down on the side of how much is this child struggling? And how willing am I to put myself in the way of discomfort on behalf of my child who doesn't know what's wrong and doesn't have the mental capacity to figure it out.
Right.
Right. So they're depending on me to figure it out. So let me get my own stuff out of the way, work through that, right? Get a therapist or a coach for yourself. And then let me see what's happening here so that I can have the patience and the mental capacity to confront the hard questions about, okay, what is it that my child needs? How can I make this better for them? How can I make this a little bit easier for them today or going forward? Right? Even if that's kind of short-term pain for long-term gain, in terms of interventions or, things that are hard.
Yeah, wow. I have so many questions for you, but I'll end with this last one, and hopefully we can do another one.
I would love to.
This is so much fun and so informative. So I have a question about schooling. Would you say, I feel like there are more and more parents who are choosing to homeschool, or what I hear, privately educate, where it's not them per se teaching their kids, where they bring tutors. So would you say that kids like Orchid Kids or complicated kids would benefit from this type of alternative education?
Lots of them do. Yeah. Listen, I think it's not so much a question of what modality are you using. There are so many schools of educational thought in the world. There's Reggio and Montessori and like experiential learning, and there's all kinds of flavors. And for Orchid Kids, for complicated kids, the question is not what approach is best. The question is, what approach creates the feeling of safety and connection? What approach or person is going to create neurological safety, nervous system safety, so that children can learn? That's the relevant question. It's not, is homeschool better than regular school? Because I have encountered plenty of public school teachers who can create a sense of safety for their students, and those students can learn in that classroom.
That's why you also emphasize the person. So it's not just about the type of schooling, the person. Okay.
Yeah, it matters. Nervous systems matter over everything. And feeling safe is something that complicated kids really struggle with. And so they rely on that interbrain, on that other person's nervous system to create safety for them. And that is the most important thing.
That soil, that'll create the healthy soil for them to thrive and grow.
There you go. Exactly. Wow. Yeah. Yeah.
This was such an amazing conversation. I'm sure so many parents out there get value from this. And can you tell us, where can we connect with you? If people want to work with you, where can they get in touch with you?
Yes, they can find me at raisingorchidkids.com. You can email raisingorchidkids@gmail.com. And that's probably the easiest place to find me. We have a checklist on the homepage of the website where people can download a little checklist about, am I raising an orchid kid? So if you listen to this and thought, oh, I might have an orchid, it's not scientific, but it is informative.
Yeah, a place to start, right?
Exactly, it's a place to start. We have group classes over there. We have one-on-one coaching over there, and all of that's available. We have webinars periodically that we do, and all of that's available at raisingorchidkids.com.
Awesome. So I'll be sure to link everything below in the show notes. And thank you so much. This was an amazing conversation, and I can't wait for us to do this again.
I was delighted. Thank you for having me. It was really fun.
Thank you so much for tuning in to Maternity Leave. I hope you found value in this episode. Your support means the world. By subscribing, leaving a comment, and sharing this episode with another mom entrepreneur, you'll help it grow and reach more incredible guests who can share their insights and guidance. Until next time, take care, love on your loved ones, and make it happen. You got this.
And it's a ticket talking Mazda for the biggest. That's a comma and a comma and a comma. Gotta get it, get it. And it's a ticket talking Mazda for the biggest. That's a comma and a comma and a comma. Gotta get it.